In the blazing heart of the ancient world, there stood a kingdom that once believed itself untouchable. Egypt, crowned in gold, wrapped in glory, now trembled beneath the quiet echo of approaching storms. Rivals gathered beyond its borders, restless kingdoms waited for weakness, and the great empire of the Nile felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon its throne. Power was slipping, confidence was fading, and destiny was watching. This is where our story begins, not with triumph, but with vulnerability. A mighty civilization stands exposed, unsure, and surrounded by enemies who smell opportunity in the desert wind. Armies sharpen their blades, ambitious rulers whisper of invasion, priests pray to distant gods, while the people wonder whether those gods are still listening. Egypt needs more than a king. It needs a force that can reshape its fate. And somewhere within this uneasy silence, a young ruler prepares to step into history. He is not yet the legend the world will remember. He is not yet the unstoppable conqueror etched into temple walls. He is simply a man about to be tested by fire. Every doubt, every threat, every shadow gathering around Egypt is about to forge something extraordinary. The world does not know it yet, but a transformation is about to begin. For what rises from fragile beginnings is not merely a warrior. What emerges from these coming storms is a Pharaoh who will bend the battlefield to his will. A leader whose campaigns will stretch across lands once thought unreachable. A man who will be remembered not as mortal, but as something far greater. Many kings seek power. Few become legends. Even fewer become myth. This is the story of that ascension. The story of how a human ruler became, in the eyes of his enemies and his own people, a god of war. And to understand how such a figure could be created, we must first understand the Egypt he inherited, the world that surrounded him, and the dangers waiting in every direction.
Because before the deity was born, a kingdom stood on the edge of collapse, and that is where the true transformation begins. To see the rise, we must first step back into that fragile Egypt, a land of rival powers, uneasy alliances, and a throne trembling beneath the weight of destiny, where every decision would decide whether the empire lived or vanished in the sands beyond. Before greatness swept across its borders, Egypt stood in a fragile balance. The empire glittered with monuments and memory, but its foundations trembled beneath uncertainty. Power was divided, authority questioned, and the throne itself felt less like a symbol of divine certainty and more like a seat surrounded by doubt. Rivals within the court maneuvered quietly, foreign enemies waited patiently, and every crack in the kingdom felt wider than the last. Egypt still looked magnificent from afar, but up close, the fractures were impossible to ignore.
Years of shifting leadership and competing claims had weakened the aura of absolute control. Alliances that once seemed eternal were now uncertain. Provinces whispered of independence. Vassal states sensed hesitation and began testing the limits of Egyptian dominance. Messengers brought uneasy reports, not of triumph, but of unrest gathering like dark clouds at the horizon. The image of an invincible empire was fading, and in its place rose a far more dangerous reality. Egypt could be challenged. Inside the royal circles, politics was its own silent battlefield.
Advisors fought with words instead of blades. Priests argued over destiny, and generals debated whether Egypt should defend what it had or risk everything to regain its fearsome reputation. The nation still had strength, wealth, and history, but none of that mattered if leadership lacked certainty. The people looked to the palace for direction, and instead found hesitation.
In the ancient world, hesitation was an invitation, and many were ready to answer it. Beyond Egypt's borders, rival powers watched eagerly. Ambitious leaders imagined their banners flying where Egyptian standards once stood. Trade routes were threatened, diplomatic relationships strained, and enemies who once dared not speak against Egypt now spoke openly of opportunity. A single misstep could tilt the balance, and the sands of power were already shifting. This was Egypt before the storm, proud yet uneasy, magnificent yet vulnerable, an empire built on glory, now struggling to hold on to it. It was a kingdom standing at the edge of something monumental, though no one yet knew whether that future meant collapse or rebirth. But history has a way of choosing its moments, and destiny rarely waits for comfort. In this looming tension, when doubt was strongest and danger closest, a figure was preparing to rise, one whose ambition, brilliance, and relentless will would not simply restore Egypt's strength, but redefine it entirely. Soon the quiet whisper of uncertainty would meet a voice that allowed no hesitation. Soon the scattered pieces of power would gather around a single commanding will. The world beyond Egypt did not yet know his name, but it would learn to fear it, carve it into stone, and remember it for millennia. For in the heart of this fragile empire, a leader was about to step forward, not as a caretaker of survival, but as the architect of domination. And once he began his march, the ancient world would never be the same again. This is where the rebirth of power truly begins, for Egypt at last. From the very beginning, Thutmose was not the golden heir destiny usually favors. He arrived in a court already dominated by stronger personalities, older claimants, and political figures who believed they could shape Egypt without him. He was present, but rarely centered. Decisions were made above him, expectations were placed around him, and his future seemed destined to remain in the shadow of others. Yet history has a way of hiding its greatest weapons in plain sight, and while the court overlooked him, something powerful was forming within. He watched, he listened, he learned. Where others enjoyed privilege, he endured discipline. Where others relied on status, he relied on will. The palace that confined him also trained him. Every slight, every dismissal, every reminder that he was not the first choice became fuel. Instead of breaking, it forged a sharper mind, a colder focus, and an ambition that would one day shake the ancient world. But his rise was not only emotional, it was deeply practical. Thutmose was drawn toward the world of soldiers and steel.
Instead of merely wearing a crown, he wanted to understand what defended it. He studied military structure, strategy, weapons, and the psychology of command. While courtiers debated politics, he stood among warriors. While nobles polished protocol, he sharpened determination. The battlefield would one day be his language, and he was preparing to speak it fluently. Still, doubt surrounded him. There were many who believed he was untested, too quiet, too overshadowed to ever dominate. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook patience for passivity. What they did not see was the relentless fire building behind controlled composure. He was not rushing toward power. He was preparing to master it. And when fate finally opened the door, Thutmose did not walk. He surged forward. The overlooked prince no longer carried the burden of uncertainty. He carried purpose. Years of frustration transformed into clarity. Years of being underestimated crystallized into strength. This was no longer the boy pushed to the margins. This was the emerging ruler the empire desperately needed. The world had expected a caretaker. What it received was a storm wrapped in discipline, a ruler who combined emotional endurance with ruthless precision. Those who once dismissed him now began to realize their mistake, and those who opposed him sensed a changing tide. He would not simply hold Egypt together. He would redefine what Egyptian power meant. This is the chapter where the war god begins to form, not through divine miracle, but through human struggle, resilience, and an unbreakable will to rise above every limit placed upon him. And as the throne begins to shift towards his grasp, the world beyond Egypt has no idea what is about to awaken. The boy in the shadows is gone. In his place stands the beginning of a relentless ruler, ready to face his first true test, and ready to turn preparation into action.
What comes next is no cautious step, but a plunge into the fires of real conflict. Beyond Egypt's borders, enemies wait, alliances tremble, and his destiny will finally collide with the battlefield. The years of watching are over. The era of doing has arrived, and the world is about to witness his first campaigns begin. This is where legend stops waiting and finally moves forward. He did not begin his rule with unstoppable confidence. Thutmose's first campaigns unfolded under the heavy shadow of doubt. Doubt from foreign enemies who believed Egypt had weakened, and doubt from those inside his own kingdom who wondered whether this young ruler could truly command war. When he first marched beyond Egypt's borders, every step carried risk. Mistakes would not just cost battles, they could cost the empire itself. Yet instead of collapsing under the pressure, Thutmose treated the battlefield as a vast school of power, where every moment taught him how to lead, how to strike, and how to win.
His earliest engagements revealed a mind that did not rely solely on brute strength. He studied terrain, movement, psychology, and timing. Where previous leaders hesitated, he acted with calculated precision. When enemies expected a reckless young king, they instead found a strategist who understood fear, both his own and of the men who followed him. He learned to turn hesitation into discipline and uncertainty into planning. Each confrontation, successful or difficult, sharpened him further. The battlefield, brutal as it was, began shaping him into something far more dangerous than a simple warrior, a commander who could bend chaos into order. These campaigns were not merely about conquest, they were about transformation. Thutmose began forging an army that reflected his mind, fast, intelligent, and relentless. He refined logistics, improved mobility, and demanded loyalty not through fear alone, but through earned respect.
Soldiers who once wondered whether he could lead now marched with confidence under his banner. They saw a ruler who rode with them, who understood risk, and who turned danger into opportunity. With every victory, his aura grew. With every challenge, his determination hardened. But war is never clean. These early campaigns exposed him to harsh truths, the cost of power, the weight of command, and the reality that domination requires unwavering resolve. Cities resisted, enemies plotted. The political world watched every move, ready to exploit any sign of weakness. Instead of breaking, Thutmose absorbed these pressures. He learned when to show mercy
and when to crush opposition without hesitation. His ambition no longer belonged to a young prince proving himself. It became the driving force of a ruler shaping destiny. By the time his early campaigns drew breath, Thutmose was no longer simply learning war. He was beginning to master it.
The boy who once stood in the shadows had now marched into the storm and found clarity inside it. His rivals were starting to understand that this was not a temporary swell of Egyptian power. This was the rise of a force that intended to reshape the map. Yet everything so far had only been preparation. Ahead lay a confrontation unlike anything before, a campaign that would test every lesson he had learned and announce his presence to the ancient world with thunder. The world was about to witness the battle that would define his legend, and nothing would ever be the same again. They said the road to Megiddo was madness. Advisors warned him. Generals urged caution. Enemies expected hesitation. Yet Thutmose chose the most dangerous path, not because it was reckless, but because it was the last thing his enemies believed he would dare attempt. It was a move born from confidence, intelligence, and psychological warfare. If he survived, Egypt would dominate. If he failed, Egypt could crumble.
With that single decision, he transformed the battlefield into a stage and Megiddo into destiny. His army moved through terrain his enemies thought impassable. Every soldier knew the risk. Every commander understood the stakes. But as they advanced, something powerful began to form: belief. Belief not only in Egypt, but in the man leading it. When they emerged before Megiddo, they did so like a storm appearing out of nowhere. The enemy never expected him to be there, at that moment, in that way. Shock is a weapon, and Thutmose wielded it perfectly. The battlefield exploded into chaos. Opposing forces believed their numbers and fortified position guaranteed victory. They underestimated the mind opposing them. Thutmose did not seek just to fight. He sought to break their will. Precision, speed, and relentless pressure became his greatest tools. He struck not simply to kill, but to shatter confidence, to make his enemies feel the inevitability of defeat creeping into their ranks. Panic spread. Lines collapsed. What began as a challenge turned into a chase. Those who had mocked Egyptian strength now fled for their lives. Then came the siege. Megiddo was not going to surrender easily. Behind its walls, leaders believed they could outlast him. They underestimated his patience as much as they underestimated his fury. Thutmose sealed the city, cutting off escape, cutting off supplies, cutting off hope. Days turned to weeks as fear replaced resistance. Inside the walls, desperation grew. Outside the walls, Egypt stood unwavering. This was not reckless youth. This was disciplined dominance. Slowly, inevitably, Megiddo weakened. And when the city finally broke, the world felt the shock. This victory was not just military. It was psychological, political, and symbolic. It sent a message across kingdoms and continents. Egypt was not merely restored. Egypt was supreme. Thutmose III was no uncertain ruler struggling to prove himself.
He was now a force kings whispered about, a commander whose decisions rewrote expectations and whose victories rewrote the map. Megiddo changed everything. It secured power. It silenced doubters. It transformed Thutmose in the eyes of his enemies and his own people alike. This was the moment his legend crystallized, carved not in stone alone, but in the fear of those who now knew what he was capable of. Yet the most extraordinary truth was this: Megiddo was not the peak. It was only the beginning. Because after proving he could win the impossible, Thutmose did not slow down. He accelerated.
The world had witnessed the birth of a legend. Now it would witness an empire forged by relentless campaigns, ruthless intelligence, and a ruler who no longer questioned whether he belonged on the throne. He had proven himself on the battlefield. Soon he would prove that Megiddo was not his greatest triumph, only the first of many that would reshape history forever.
After Megiddo, the ancient world expected Egypt to pause, to celebrate, to breathe. Instead, Thutmose turned victory into momentum. Where other rulers secured borders, he expanded them. He refused to rule a stable kingdom. He would command a dominant one. From this moment forward, campaigns did not come in seasons, they came in waves. City after city felt the thunder of his advance. Allies who once promised loyalty now had to prove it. Defiant states were crushed with speed that stunned observers. Thutmose marched not as a hesitant monarch, but as a commander sculpting geography to his will. He struck quickly, disappeared, then returned again, denying enemies any sense of safety. His campaigns stretched far beyond what most thought possible. He pushed into lands that once dismissed Egypt as a weakened memory and forced them to kneel before renewed power. Tribute flowed like rivers.
Wealth, resources, and captives strengthened Egypt's engine of war, allowing every victory to finance the next. But conquest was not only physical, it was psychological. Rulers across the region began to measure decisions by one question: what will Thutmose do? His reputation traveled ahead of his armies, weakening resistance before his soldiers even arrived. Fear became a weapon, and he wielded it ruthlessly. Yet with every triumph came transformation. The young ruler, shaped by adversity, was evolving into something larger than life. Victories hardened him, responsibility weighed on him, and the line between necessity and ambition began to blur. He had proven he could defend Egypt. Now he seemed determined to define it. Behind triumphs lay cost. Fields burned, cities surrendered, and countless lives were reshaped by his relentless march. Egypt grew richer, stronger, and more feared, but the empire was now bound to the will of a man who no longer accepted limits.
The world had witnessed dominance on an expanding scale, and still he did not slow. Every victory demanded another. Every conquest invited the next horizon. His campaigns were becoming legend while he still lived, and the ancient world realized this was no temporary blaze. It was a rising empire consuming everything before it. Yet even this relentless dominance was only a chapter. Beyond these victories waited a deeper transformation, where power, myth, and destiny would intertwine to shape not only Egypt's fate, but the man leading it. His armies marched like moving cities, organized, disciplined, and terrifying in their efficiency. They struck with speed, secured with control, and left behind unmistakable proof that resistance carried a price no kingdom wished to pay. Thutmose rewarded loyalty, punished defiance, and carefully stitched every conquered territory into a growing network of Egyptian dominance. The empire was not simply expanding outward, it was tightening its grip. He controlled trade, demanded tribute, and positioned Egypt not merely as a regional force, but as the power other nations measured themselves against. For his soldiers, these years forged loyalty bordering on reverence. They followed him because he won, because he led from the front, and because every campaign proved that marching with him meant standing on the stronger side of history. To allies, he was protector. To enemies,
He was approaching doom. Yet beneath the triumph and thunder, something more profound was forming. Thutmose was no longer simply winning wars. He was crafting an identity larger than any mortal ruler should carry. Each conquest fed the legend. Each victory pushed him closer to the realm of myth, where kings are remembered not as men, but as forces of history. That transformation was coming, and when it arrived, the world would understand why he would forever be remembered as Egypt's god of war. Victories alone do not create gods. Belief does.
As Thutmose's empire expanded, something extraordinary grew with it. The world did not simply witness a brilliant commander. It began to see a figure wrapped in legend, a leader whose victories felt preordained. Egyptian culture already tied kings to the divine, but Thutmose's triumphs pushed that bond beyond tradition. Temples carved his power into stone. Priests spoke of destiny. Artists portrayed him not merely as ruler, but as chosen weapon of the gods, marching with sacred approval behind every strike. Fear helped shape this image as much as faith. Enemies needed an explanation for defeats so overwhelming that resistance seemed foolish. To them, claiming he was favored by divine forces made more sense than admitting they faced a human mind that simply outclassed them. His campaigns became stories. Stories became symbols, and symbols became myths. Each retelling elevated him higher, until people no longer asked whether he could win.
They wondered whether anyone could stop him at all. But behind the legend lived a man, sharp, disciplined, relentlessly strategic. The god of war image was powerful propaganda, yet it also reflected undeniable brilliance. Thutmose understood terrain, timing, psychology, loyalty, and fear. His divinity may have been sculpted by belief, but his dominance was built through intellect. He was not invincible. He simply left opponents feeling as if he was. That perception mattered more than truth. In the ancient world, fear could conquer long before armies arrived. And so a paradox formed. Was Thutmose III a god crafted by religion and narrative? Or was he a mortal so exceptional that divinity felt like the only explanation? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between perception and power. What is certain is that by this stage, he was no longer just a king commanding armies. He was an idea, one etched into faith, politics, and the minds of every ruler forced to weigh decisions against his shadow. Yet titles like God of War carry consequences. Legends inspire loyalty, but they also demand constant proof. Power built on awe must never appear weak. As Egypt grew richer, stronger, and more dominant under his command, another truth began to rise. The empire itself was changing alongside its ruler, and soon the results of his mythic power would reshape Egypt forever. After Megiddo, the ancient world expected Egypt to pause, to celebrate, to breathe. Instead, Thutmose turned victory into momentum. Where other rulers secured borders, he expanded them. He refused to rule a stable kingdom. He would command a dominant one. From this moment forward, campaigns did not come in seasons. They came in waves. City after city felt the thunder of his advance. Allies who once promised loyalty now had to prove it. Defiant states were crushed with speed that stunned observers.
Thutmose marched not as a hesitant monarch, but as a commander sculpting geography to his will. He struck quickly, disappeared, then returned again, denying enemies any sense of safety. His campaign stretched far beyond what most thought possible. He pushed into lands that once dismissed Egypt as weakened memory and forced them to kneel before renewed power. Tribute flowed like rivers,
Wealth, resources, and captives strengthened Egypt's engine of war, allowing every victory to finance the next. But conquest was not only physical, it was psychological. Rulers across the region began to measure decisions by one question: what will Thutmose do? His reputation traveled ahead of his armies, weakening resistance before his soldiers even arrived. Fear became a weapon, and he wielded it ruthlessly. Yet with every triumph came transformation. The young ruler, shaped by adversity, was evolving into something larger than life.
Victories hardened him. Responsibility weighed on him. And the line between necessity and ambition began to blur. He had proven he could defend Egypt. Now he seemed determined to define it. Behind triumphs lay cost. Fields burned, cities surrendered, and countless lives were reshaped by his relentless march. Egypt grew richer, stronger, and more feared, but the empire was now bound to the will of a man who no longer accepted limits. The world had witnessed dominance on an expanding scale, and still he did not slow. Every victory demanded another. Every conquest invited the next horizon. His campaigns were becoming legend while he still lived, and the ancient world realized this was no temporary blaze. It was a rising empire consuming everything before it. Yet even this relentless dominance was only a chapter. Beyond these victories waited a deeper transformation, where power, myth, and destiny would intertwine to shape not only Egypt's fate, but the man leading it.
His armies marched like moving cities, organized, disciplined, and terrifying in their efficiency. They struck with speed, secured with control, and left behind unmistakable proof that resistance carried a price no kingdom wished to pay. Thutmose rewarded loyalty, punished defiance, and carefully stitched every conquered territory into a growing network of Egyptian dominance. The empire was not simply expanding outward, it was tightening its grip. He controlled trade, demanded tribute, and positioned Egypt not merely as a regional force, but as the power other nations measured themselves against. For his soldiers, these years forged loyalty bordering on reverence. They followed him because he won, because he led from the front, and because every campaign proved that marching with him meant standing on the stronger side of history. To allies, he was protector. To enemies, he was approaching doom. Yet beneath the triumph and thunder, something more profound was forming.
Thutmose was no longer simply winning wars. He was crafting an identity larger than any mortal ruler should carry. Each conquest fed the legend. Each victory pushed him closer to the realm of myth, where kings are remembered not as men, but as forces of history. That transformation was coming, and when it arrived, the world would understand why he would forever be remembered as Egypt's god of war. When the dust of conquest finally began to settle, what remained was not simply a victorious kingdom, but a transformed civilization. The empire Thutmose III left behind was broader, richer, and more structurally powerful than anything Egypt had commanded before. Trade routes flourished under Egyptian control, wealth flowed into temples and cities, and the empire's economy expanded with resources drawn from lands that once dared to challenge Egyptian authority. Markets grew louder, cities brightened, and the empire's influence reached into everyday life, far beyond the battlefield.
Militarily, Thutmose reshaped how power was applied. He built an army not just to fight, but to dominate. Organization improved, strategy evolved, command culture strengthened. Egypt no longer relied purely on prestige. It relied on proven force, disciplined structure, and tested leadership. The empire became safer under his strength, but also forever tied to the expectation that only power could secure peace. His campaigns created stability, but stability built on relentless vigilance. Culturally, his legacy etched itself into stone, art, and memory. Temples celebrated him as chosen, walls carved his victories into eternal narrative, and generations grew up under the shadow of a ruler who seemed more legend than man. Children heard his name in stories, rulers invoked him as standard, enemies remembered him as warning. He was history and myth layered together, shaping how Egypt understood greatness, leadership, and destiny itself.
Politically, his empire set a precedent. Egypt would not survive by standing still. Power had to move, expand, and assert. His leadership forged a political mindset where strength equaled legitimacy. Future rulers inherited a world shaped by his ambition, and whether they embraced or failed it, they would always be measured against the man who had expanded Egypt to its greatest height. Yet, every towering legacy carries weight. His triumphs came at a cost, written across lands conquered and lives changed forever. His empire thrived on dominance, and with dominance came responsibility, one that would challenge every ruler who followed. But none could deny what he had built. Egypt was not merely secure, it was exceptional. Not merely feared, it was revered. Thutmose III did more than protect a kingdom. He redefined civilization in the region and reshaped how history would remember Egyptian power.
What remained after him was not only empire, but legend, a foundation so monumental that it would echo far beyond his lifetime. And as the world stepped forward from his era, one question lingered in history's shadow. How does a man so mighty transition from conqueror to something eternal? History remembers countless rulers, but only a rare few seem to step beyond the limits of mortality. Thutmose III belongs to that narrow realm. He did not simply inherit a throne. He seized destiny, reshaped it, and left the world different than he found it. His life was carved into stone, echoed through temples, whispered in the fear of enemies and the pride of his own people. Even centuries later, his presence feels less like a fading memory and more like a force still moving beneath the surface of history. He proved that power is not only taken by sword, but forged by mind, discipline, and unwavering will. He showed that leadership can terrify and inspire at the same time, that an empire can be both shielded and sharpened through one man's determination. His victories were not just lines on a map, they were tides that shifted how civilizations thought about strength, ambition, and the weight of command. Yet behind the myth stood a man of breadth, decision, and burden. He faced doubt, risked failure, and walked a path where every victory carried a cost. That tension is what makes his story timeless. He was not untouchable by fate. He bent fate, wrestling it until it shaped the world he envisioned. And when his reign ended, the echo did not. Egypt stood taller because of him. Rivals remembered him. Generations measured greatness against the standard he created. Time may weather monuments and silence voices, but legacies like his refuse to fade. They transform from history into legend, from legend into something almost eternal.
So, when we look back at Thutmose III, we do not merely see a king or a conqueror. We see a moment in human story where determination became destiny, where a mortal ruler rose so high that people could only explain his power by calling him divine. His campaigns ended, but the idea of him never did. That is why his name endures, not simply because he won, but because he changed what winning meant. And in that truth, his story stretches beyond chronicles and into imagination, reminding us that history is not only about events, but about the rare individuals who bend the world toward their will. Thutmose III did not fade into the past. He stepped into eternity, and there his legend continues to march. Long after empires fall, his shadow still defines greatness for many.